Hi, I'm the Moonlit Page Turner, and wow, we are already halfway through 2024. So that means it's time for second quarter reads, where I'm going to share with you the books that I have read so far in April, May, and June. I'm going to divide them into the same categories that I did last time. So I'm going to start with some book club reads. I'm in the Savvy Gaming Network's video game book club, as well as the Read the World series that I have here on YouTube. And then I'm going to get into some of the nonfiction reads that I've read and the fiction reads. And so for each of the books that I'm going to talk about, you'll see a little symbol pop on your screen. It's either going to be the audiobook, the physical book, and then I do also have one on Kindle this time around. So I do read books on all formats. I get a lot of my books from the library. So you'll see some physical copies and you'll see images of others. So if I have a physical copy, that means that I have purchased it often used, or Book Outlet is a great way to find books for cheap. But I do get a lot of my books from the library. There are also going to be chapters below. So please feel free to skip to whatever book you are interested in hearing about. For the reads for the Savvy Gaming Network's video game book club, I did have physical copies of all books, but Savvy actually has my copies of Halo and Marvel's Spider-Man. So you'll see those pop up, but I did actually read those in physical form. She and I go back and forth choosing books each month, and then she often does the audiobook version. So through the podcast that I will list below, you can see her take on the audio version as well as my take on the physical version. So the first book that we read for Savvy Gaming Network was Halo: Fall of Reach by Eric Nyland. I haven't played Halo in a really, really long time, so it took me a little bit to get acclimated back into the world of Master Chief. But I actually liked this book. It was really entertaining. It moved pretty quickly. I gave it 4 stars, and I was surprised how much I liked this one. The second book that we read for the month of May was Marvel's Spider-Man's Hostile Takeover, and that was by David Bliss. We had just finished playing Spider-Man 2, so we played all the Spider-Mans by Insomniac, and this one fell a little flat for me. I only gave this one 2 stars. I didn't feel like it fit quite into the world of Spider-Man. This is actually the prequel before the first game, and I was missing some of the quippiness that kind of gets irritating from Spider-Man, but I was missing it a little bit. So um, it has Fisk and Echo and Blood Spider are kind of your antagonists. It does take place before the first game, but I was not so impressed with this one. The most recent book that we read for Savvy Gaming Network was Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear Frights Into the Pit. And this is, of course, by Scott Cawthon, who is the creator of Five Nights at Freddy. And then we have Ellie Cooper, who is also mentioned on this book. And I feel like Ellie Cooper really had a hand in the last 2 stories. This is a 3-story collection, Into the Pit, which is the picture here is the first story, and for me it was the only one that really felt like a FNaF story. The other 2 stories have female protagonists. The first story has a male protagonist. He's about 10, and then the other 2 are teenage girls. They all deal with animatronics. They're all kind of dark and spooky, but from the books, this is actually our third FNaF book. The only one that really felt truly of Five Nights at Freddy's was the first one. So the book actually wasn't written poorly. Like, it was written pretty well. It's just the stories fell a little flat for me. The first story, Into the Pit, was actually good. For the Read the World series that I do here on YouTube, so I have books from 3 different countries. We have Barbados, we have Belarus, and we have Belgium. So I'm going to start with Barbados. I have 2 books. I have Flickering Shadows, and this is by Quadro Agima Kamau. And this book was interesting in the fact that your narrator dies in the first chapter and is a spirit for the rest of it. And he is kind of looking after his grandson and his granddaughter and their partners, and sees the changes that goes through his small town as a white minister comes from the mainland and shakes things up. There's also some historical aspects to this as well. I thought it was really well written. It gets kind of dark towards the end, and it was just a journey throughout the entire book. So I really liked Flickering Shadows. I gave it 4 stars. I would recommend it. It was a great read. Unfortunately, the Burning Bush Women and Other Stories by Cherry Jones was not so great of a read. There are some really outstanding stories in here. So there are short stories. A lot of them have some of the same themes. We see a lot about adultery, and then we see a lot about relationships between mothers and daughters, especially when they are estranged or neglected. There were probably about 3 or 4 stories that I found fantastic, and then the other ones just fell flat for me. So, in all, I would say I was not super impressed with the Burning Bush Women. The Burning Bush Women story in here was actually really good, but as a collection itself, it just fell a little flat for me. The next country that we're going to visit is Belarus, and I have 2 very different books. So, King Stakhl's Wild Hunt, and this is by Vladimir Karakovic. I really enjoyed. This is a folklorist dreams. He is actually the main character is a folklorist, and he goes to a town to learn about their villages, and then he becomes part of the legend there. So King Stakhl's Wild Hunt is actually it was a movie, and I watched some of it. I would recommend the book over the movie. It reminded me a lot of The Hounds of Baskervilles, and as well as a little bit the fall of the House of Usher. So there's a legend that's the King Stakhl, and he was killed, and he's kind of cursed the ruling family there to die an early death. And so our main character, he has to figure out the truth from the fiction. And so I really enjoyed this one. Again, it was really beautifully written. The next book from Belarus is nonfiction, and this is Last Witnesses, and this was actually adapted for young adult readers. This is by Svetlana Alexievich, and she is a Nobel Peace Prize winner for literature. She went and talked to people who were children during World War II. And in particular, she talked to the people of Ukraine, Belarus, and the areas that were kind of part of the Soviet Union and then got taken over by the Germans. This book took me a while to read just because it was so emotional, and I cried multiple times. It definitely put me in a funk, but it's one of those books that is really important to read, especially when we see what war does to children and how it affects them even later on in life. As 50-year-old women, men and women, they're still looking for their parents, and they're still traumatized by the events of when they were, some of them 5, 6. I think the youngest person in here is 2, and a lot of them are like 10 to 12. So it is an important read, but it was a really difficult read. For Belgium, I was excited to read Belgium because my family history comes from them. So I chose 2 very different books as well. So I have War and Turpentine, and this is by Stefan Hertmans. And this is considered historical fiction, although Hertmans has his grandfather's journals, and he turns that kind of into a story. So Hertmans' grandfather was in World War I, and so we see the historical aspect of that as well as growing up in that time period. It's called War and Turpentine because his grandfather was an artist and his great grandfather was an artist as well. So we see what life was like, and it goes kind of back and forth between Stefan and his grandfather's time period. So we see the after effects of what's happened. So technically it is historical fiction, although you can see that it is greatly, greatly inspired by those journals from his grandfather. The other book that I chose from Belgium is 1010. So I have read other 1010 stories. This is Hergé. He's very, very famous book series. They turned it into a movie not that long ago. We're still waiting on the sequel for that movie. This one I was really hesitant to read though, because I have read some 1010 before. This is the first volume, and it has Tintin in America, it has Cigars of the Pharaohs, and then it has The Blue Lotus. Now, if you are familiar with Hergé, he wrote for a newspaper as well as did comics for that newspaper. Again, this is wartime. Somewhat problematic because the first 1010 story is actually about the Congo, and it was propaganda for the country of Belgium in their influence and imperialism in Congo. So 1010 has an interesting history. Definitely, you can tell by reading the first couple stories, they are a little problematic. However, the one of the reasons why 1010 and Hergé has outlasted some of the other comic pieces of that time is that Hergé adapts and he sees kind of the errors of his racist uh, ground. And especially, I'm glad that they put the Blue Lotus in here because we see that turn and we see 1010 himself as a character step in and say, like, this is wrong. You can't treat people like that just based on their background. We do still see some of the influences, especially of World War II, with the way that the Japanese are depicted in this story. Um, in America, it definitely looks like that Hergé has never made it to America and was only watching American movies because the Native Americans and even the Mexicans, again, not great. There are some black characters in the Cigars of the Pharaohs that are very depicted of the time, which would not be allowed today. So I'm glad that they put the Blue Lotus in there. Again, historically, it's important to see how people have changed over time. It's important to see how things and people were depicted in the time that they were. We see this with Disney as well. Disney had a lot of propaganda, so it wasn't just the Nazis, the Italians, and the Japanese. It happened throughout all of World War II, where we see different propagandas, and we continue to see that today. So I would suggest Tintin is he's an interesting character. You have to take it with a grain of salt and of the time period. I don't think it's something that should just be thrown away because it has depictions, because there is some historical importance with the way that we have depicted people in the past and allowing people to change and kind of correct the way that they come in the storytelling. So, although these two, I was really nervous to read. I'm glad again that the Blue Lotus is on there. Not great for the Japanese, but it does talk about some of the racial things that come up in Tenten. My nonfiction reads for this quarter were very different. I started with reading The Wager, which is a tale of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder, and then that's by David Gran. And David Gran actually wrote one of my most favorite nonfiction books, which is The Lost City of Z, which talks about adventures in the Amazon, and it reads very much like fiction. So often when people are looking to get into nonfiction, I will tell them to read that book. For this one, though, I felt like if there was just a little bit of editing at the beginning of the book, this book could have been fantastic. So this book is about mutiny. You kind of start with the fact that the wager is the ship that ends up crashing with mutiny, and it's Lord Byron's grandfather. So there's a lot of intrigue at the beginning, and then I think he just falls into the pitfalls that Herman Melville did with Moby Dick, which is I don't care about boats and sailing. So he goes in a lot of detail at the beginning about the structure of these types of ships and how they run and who's in charge. And really, it's not until you get to the mutiny and the shipwreck that this book gets interesting. And then there's the follow through at the end with what happens to these people. And it pits crew member against crew member and who did what and how they're responsible. And that part I found really interesting as well as a great read. The beginning was really, really hard for me to get to. So I only rated this a 3 out of 5. If there had been some editing at the beginning, I felt like this could have been a really engaging read from the start. Then a similar kind of thing happened where I read The Monster of Florence, and this is by Douglas Preston, and it has Mario Spazzi, who is a journalist in Italy and Preston's kind of source. And The Monster of Florence is about a serial killer who killed couples in their cars from the 70s to the 80s in Florence. He's kind of their Jack the Ripper, and he's never been found. And so this book is told in 3 parts. The first part is about the murders themselves and about who may be the killer. Then we get the fact that Douglas Preston goes to Florence to write a book. This is not the book that he originally goes to write, but he starts learning about the area that he's living in and then he starts investigating. He starts investigating the murder, and the Italian police start investigating him because him and Spezzi are getting really close to things and talking to people. And why is he getting involved after all of this time? And so Preston then becomes part of the story, so much so that he is told that if he comes back to Italy, he will be arrested. So he is looked at as an accomplice. His friend C is actually looked at as a person who may be the monster of Florence. And so things go really wrong. Here, I thought the first chapter was the most interesting. And then when it became more about Douglas Preston and his story within the story, I kind of lost a lot of interest. You do hear a lot of gory details, as well as about the suspects who are awful people to begin with. There is a really interesting culture within the culture there where you have couples who go to cars to spend time together, and then you have people that go to watch them. And it was a little surprising with all of the people that were watching that no one knew who this murder was. And today it's still unsolved and probably will not be solved. Preston and Spezzi do put forth who they think it is, and that person has since passed away. So we may never know who the monster of Florence is. So I thought the first part of it, where it talks about the actual murders, was interesting. The other part, though, I didn't really care for. Learning about different people, I then read Counting the Cost by Jill Duggar Dillard, and she is part of the Duggar clan with 19 and Counting. And this is about her time on the show and the effects of what happened afterwards. And at first, when I started reading this, I was a little concerned for Jill. It seemed as if she hadn't really learned a lesson, but then you kind of get that she's writing it from the perspective of this is life at that time. And that makes a whole lot of sense because she definitely has a lot to say. She did not really get paid for her time on 19 and Counting. And that has to do with the contracts that her dad had her sign. And she talks about her relationship with her family later on, as well as their own show, and then her missionary work with her husband. So at first, I was really worried for Jill. And then as soon as I kind of figured out what was going on with her writing, then I was hooked. I thought it was really well written, and I thought she was very, very honest about what happened, especially with what happened with her sisters and her brother and how that was portrayed in the media and how their as minors their testimony was leaked and there's no consequences for that, which is mind-blowing because should be protections for kids who have that happen to them. And I'm glad that she has a support structure and she seems to be really doing well after all of the things that have happened to her in her life. So I thought it was fantastic. I did the audio version of Counting the Cost, and she reads it, and she did fantastic. Another book where I'm looking at experience of young women, I read Emily Ratajkowski's My Body. This book has been highly recommended by quite a few people, and so I was really interested to learn about Emily's experience in commodifying herself and her body as a model. This is a series of essays. Some of them were written in different formats, and so she's trying to explore kind of who she is as a writer and her thought process. A lot of it is stories that then have parallels to other stories. You do get the story of Blurred Lines, which is probably the thing she is most known for. She does talk a little bit about Gone Girl. What I found to me to be the best part of the book was towards the end, where she talks about being sued by the paparazzi for posting their photo of her. And then she equates that to the fact that she has done other campaigns for either a photographer or a magazine, or she did a campaign for breast cancer awareness. And then those images get used by other people without her say so and without compensating her, which would not happen in other fields. So she is pretty honest with what happens to her in her life and her feelings. She has a questionable relationship with her mom. They struggle a little bit even at the beginning, and then her mom becomes sick towards the end, and you see that kind of dichotomy of her being pushed because she's 14 when she starts modeling and the life that she lives. I When starting to read this, I was concerned for her because I was like, where are your parents? She is often unsupervised, even on like jobs when she's younger. And I think that would have been a real difference if she had kind of a strong parental figure in her life to lead her where she was. The other thing I found kind of strange is she refers to her husband, who's now her ex husband, as S. She talks about him being her husband, and I don't know if that's just what she called him, but it was odd to see someone who you could easily Google as S. So that was weird for me. Again, turning around, different types of nonfiction. I read The Modern Miss Mason by Lee Bode, and Lee Bode has a podcast about Modern Miss Mason, and this talks about um, Charlotte Mason. Charlotte Mason is kind of a homeschool icon from the late 1800s. She was from England, and she talks about the whole child. And so this is Leah's kind of connection to Charlotte. She talks a lot about Charlotte's life and her teachings. Each chapter starts with a different teaching of Charlotte, and she talks about how to incorporate that within your own homeschooling. This kind of reminded me of Julie and Julia, where you had the it was a blog, and then it got turned into a book, then it got turned into a movie where she kind of takes on Julia Child's cooking. It's really similar to the fact that she's now taking on Charlotte Mason to teach her own children. So if you have not heard of Charlotte Mason, or if you're interested in learning about Charlotte Mason, I would say this is a good start. She also has a podcast, and so you can see kind of the principles of the Charlotte Mason educational plan. The last book in the nonfiction is Homebody. It's a book of poems, so they're pretty short. This is Rupi Kaur. Well, uh, I read Rupi Kaur's other book, which was Milk and Honey, and then they're somewhat similar in the way that she writes her poems. For me, I like poems to have structure, and I like them. They don't have to rhyme, but I mean, most of my favorite poets are a little bit more in depth. This felt to me more of like reading her diary. Again, some of them are fairly short. Some of them don't have grammatical structure or any type of structure. Like, for example, this one is I'm not my worst days. I'm not what happened to me. Reminder. And that's the poem, which is a good thought. And again, it just felt like I was reading her diary. So this one felt really personal. Milk and Honey also is very personal. One of my students actually suggested it to me, and it was a good, I think, introduction to different types of poetry. This one I thought was just okay. Okay, looking at fiction. So I have a lot of fantasy on here as well as young adult fantasy. I have been trying to whittle down my TBR list. Guys, it's not working. I keep adding to it. So I try to attack it from both sides. So I looked at my Goodreads account, which I think I started in like 2011. So some of these books have been on the list for a really long time. So I decided to try to attack it from both ends of the list. And that did not work well for me for the first book that I'm going to talk about, which was The Clockwork Prince. And this is Cassandra Clare's. And this is the second book in the series. So I read the first book, which was Clockwork Angel, more than 10 years ago. And so it's been a little bit. And she does not do a good job at recapping. So I had to go on YouTube to look at a couple of reviews and recaps from the first book because she just kind of throws you in there. It was hard for me to get into this book because I didn't really remember all the stuff that happened in the first book. I think Cassandra Clare writes very, very well, and I think she's good at world building, especially in this series. I just need a little recap. So if you are looking to read the Infernal Devices series, you're going to need to read them back to back because it's really hard to jump in from one book like a decade or more or less. into one or the other. So I think this book I would have rated it higher had I had read The Clockwork Angel sooner, but it was a struggle to get back into the series. So I'm not sure if I'm going to finish the series. Again, I think she writes pretty well and she's good at world building. This one does not have the issues of her other series with the brother and sister aspect of it, but um, and it's a good if you're also like into steampunk and stuff. Like this is a good series for that. But make sure you read them back to back. Another book that has been on my TBR list for a long time was The Red Tent, and this is by Anita Diamant. And this is a lot of people's favorite books. This is historical fiction, and it is about the story of Dinah, who is from the Bible. And she's Jacob's daughter. And in the Bible, she is mentioned in like one line. She is essayed or not it's kind of rewritten for her, and this has to do with their family being kind of forced to flee because of what the brothers do to kind of take arms for their sister for what happens to her. So um I was not so impressed for this, and in my review I did say, comparison is the thief of joy, because I feel like Madeline Miller does a better job in writing her historical fictions, and in particular her historical retellings. And so it was well researched. You can tell that she put a lot of time into doing the research of the time period, but um, it was a fairly long story, and she does take a lot of liberties within the time period. It's not for me. So. The next book that I actually really, really enjoyed this book. It was really cute. It is A Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, and this is Sengu Madonna. And I got this book as a Christmas gift from my sister-in-law, and it's been on my list to read, and I kind of devoured it. It's really cute. You have a witch who she's trying to keep it secret that she's a witch, but she has a YouTube series where she kind of does like ASMR, makes potions and role plays, and she is asked to come teach three young children to, for their to teach them their magic. And she's like, "Oh, there's witches. What are witches?" And they're like, "We know you're a witch." And so she has to learn about connecting with others and family, because she's been alone for a long time. Because in this world, witches have to be separate because they can't congregate together, and oftentimes you lose your parents at a young age. And so this is a book about belonging. There's romance in here, and it was a really cute read, and I enjoyed it. The next book that I saw, it was recommended by quite a few people. It is called We Deserve Monuments by Jess Hammonds. It is young adult. There were parts of this book that I really enjoyed, but all together, especially towards the end, I got really irritated with this book. So in the book, Avery and her family move from Washington, D.C. to the South because her grandmother is sick. So her mother goes to take care of her mom. The grandmother doesn't want them there, and she is super cranky. She does have a past, and there are reasons why she acts somewhat the way that she does. She does not have a good relationship with her daughter, and so Avery, who is the granddaughter, tries to like overstep and then like figure out and fix the relationship, but she doesn't fully understand what's happening between her mom and her mom's mom, but she is like pushes herself in there to be like, she's dying, you should be nice to her. And we know that Mama Letty is not nice. So the whole We Deserve Monuments it becomes an aspect at the end, and we find out more about Mama Letty, and she does not deserve a monument. I thought the character development of Avery was good, because you see her kind of growing, and she's bisexual, although we see her be more attracted to women. We don't really see her attraction to men, and fitting in from Washington, D.C., and she has a blowout with her friends in Washington, D.C., so she comes kind of new, and she has to develop this life here. The other thing that really kind of irritated me was Jade. Jade is not responsible for her family, just like Avery's not responsible for her family. And so I feel like I really need a little justice for Jade because I don't think she did anything wrong, and she was really welcoming to Avery, and she just kind of gets pushed aside. And so I would have liked to see a little bit more of resolution in that than what kind of happened in the book. So it was a decent idea. I think some of the execution for me just fell flat, and then I got really irritated with the decisions of some of the characters. So I only rated this at 2. Some people really, really love this book. If this book is for you, we are able to have our separate opinions based on our own personal experiences and things that we look for in books. So I'm sorry if it was a really good read for you, but for me, it just fell flat. Another book that I was really excited to read that I also felt kind of didn't do it for me was The Gilded Ones, and this is Nanina Forna. And I was excited to read this because it's about female warriors, and this is also a young adult fantasy. We have our main character is going in to get her blood tested to see if she's pure or tainted, and there are some implications with that within cultures and with our own societies as well. But her ceremony gets interrupted, and so although she's not able to test her blood, they do find out that her blood is tainted. But that allows her to become a soldier in an army and kind of move her life in ways that she didn't even know was possible. And the thing that I struggled with the most with this book is Forna spends a lot of time. She spends most of the book building up the characters and building up the environment and the world building just to totally tear it down and turn it on its face. So there were things that she was very successful at, but for me, she spent a lot of time building up like what this world is just to be like, no, it's not. At first, she reminded me of some other N.K. Jemisin was one of the person that she kind of reminded me of the most. But N.K. Jemisin spends the first chunk of her book really developing the world that you live in. And so it was a slight reminder, but not quite there because I love me some N.K. Jemisin. So anyone that can write like her, I will definitely check out. All right, once again, another fall flat. And this has more to do with the audiobook version, I think, than the book itself. Some people really like this book. I've seen people really like it, and I've seen people really hate it. And that is Assistant to the Villain. And this is Hannah Nicole Meyer. And I have to say, this is probably one of the worst audiobooks I have ever listened to. If I put the time that I did in it, I would have DNF'd to this book. I actually had to look up to see if the reader was a real person or if it was AI. And that was a common question that a lot of people had. It's not necessarily because of the narrator. Her tone and her direction, I think she really needed someone to step in and kind of give her more direction. Because as she goes and she starts developing more of these characters as she reads, you can tell that these characters are growing on her as a reader, but it's just was really hard to listen to. Um, it is a slow burn romance, like super slow, all the way to the end. The villain is not really a villain, and some of the stuff in the plot didn't really make sense to me. There was a lot of like off-put things that like this happened, but it wasn't really important. So to me, it was like an exercise in world building, and I think that Meyer really built an interesting world. It's kind of like Robin Hood era medieval, but there's a lot of modern stuff, and I could easily see something like this being made into like a TV show. However, they really need to pinpoint the directions of the episodes and the directions of the characters. So world building wise, I think it was an interesting concept. Not a great audiobook to listen to. So if you are interested in reading this book, I would suggest reading it and not listening to it. I probably will not continue the series. right, going from one of my probably least favorite reads this quarter to my favorite read this quarter, and that is Warrior Girl Unearthed by Angeline Booley. This is the second book in the series. The first one was The Firekeeper's Daughter. It is within the same realm, but it is a different main character. So in Warrior Girl Unearthed, our main character is Perry. She is one of the twins from the Firekeeper's Daughter. So several years have passed in between, but we do see some of the same characters from the first book come into the second one. This is young adult, and I love this book. I love Firekeeper's Daughter, and I felt like this was an excellent sequel to it. Angeline Booley has now been on my list of I will read whatever she writes. So in this story, Perry and Pauline, they're the twins. They are 16 and they are joining a summer course or summer internship with their tribe. And Perry is very into fishing and she doesn't really want to do this. She gets in a car accident because she almost hits a bear. And so in order to fix the car, she has to do the internship because she's getting paid for it and that money will then go to fix the car. She gets involved in the museum there for the tribe, and they're working with the university to try to get some of their people because they have Native American bones as well as some of their artifacts. They're trying to get that back. And this is talks a lot about NAGPRA, which is the law in which museums, not private ones though, but and universities do need to give these items back to the tribes that they took them from. And it does a great job explaining what it is, how it came to be, and why it's still an issue for these universities as well as for these native tribes. So there is that aspect to it. Of course, it's Booley, so she's going to put in a little bit of murder as well, because that's what we saw in the last one. So these are definitely high stakes. The thing I love about these books is the cultural aspect to it and the fact that Perry and Pauline's family is so welcoming and such a part of their life, and their culture is such a part of their life, and it's just so beautifully written. I cried, and I just loved every aspect of it. So definitely, family and culture is a huge part of this book. And if you liked Firekeeper's Daughter, definitely check it out because it probably wasn't to me as great, but it was just below it. So I think she did an excellent job. The last book I'm going to talk about is actually the last book that I finished, which is Legendborn by Tracy Dion. And this is another one that I did on audio, and I thought the narrator did a fairly good job. There are some aspects when she's like crying that she goes a little bit too intense for me, but Dion did a fantastic job in setting up the story. So our main character is Bree. She's 16. Her mother just passed away from being in a car accident, and she goes to a college for early kind of acceptance. So she's taking these classes in the summer with her best friend Alice, and she sees something that kind of unsettles her and something that shouldn't be there. And because of that, it unlocks a memory of her mother. And so maybe her mother didn't die the way that she thought she did. And so Bree's really struggling with who she is as being motherless. She has before Bree and after Bree, and she builds up this wall, and then things start happening to break down that wall. And this has to do with magic. So this is young adult fantasy, and we have King Arthur come in because part of what's happening on this college campus is there's an attack, and there are these creatures, and there are these people that fight these creatures. And these people that fight these creatures, they are part of a secret society that has ties to King Arthur. And we see Bree kind of trying to fit into this group so she can find out more about her mother. And then she finds out that she has her own special abilities, and that may come from her mother and her mother's people, who she doesn't know a lot about, because not only did her mother die young in her life, but her grandmother died young in her life too. And that will become an important aspect. There is romance. There is a fall. So there are some really fun things that happen in this book. And the integration of the King Arthur myths is also a really cool aspect to it. So there are more books in the series. I thought it was a really good build. There are, though, quite a few characters. And so sometimes I forgot who was who. The relationship between Bree and her friend Alice and how that changes, and then how Bree kind of learns who she is and her abilities and tries to connect with her mother and the struggle that she has with her mother's death. I thought was really beautifully written. So it has to do with identity and parental loss. You have root magic versus ether, which is the magical aspects in this. So I really enjoyed this. I think I devoured it in a couple days. It's kind of a long book. The audiobook itself was 19 hours, but there were a couple parts where it kind of slowed down a little bit, but then it picked right back up. So all in all, I feel like Gion did a great job in storytelling. And that's it for this quarter. So I am on Instagram as well as Goodreads. So I'll continue to post things throughout the next quarter. But until then, see ya.